Good evening, everybody. I think we're about to get started. I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. Law students, I know it's your last day of classes, so we really appreciate you being here. And for everybody else who decided to show up and watch this great panel, we really appreciate it. So this event, The Future of Privacy in the Digital Age, is part of a broader speaker series centered around the question of what are the ethical and social implications of contemporary developments in information technology. The Ethics in the Information Age event series draws together scholars from Indiana University and nationally to explore this question. Our aims are to foster insights through interdisciplinary dialogue, explore potential for scholarly collaboration, and generate student engagement on topics of clear relevance to us all. Our speakers today are Fred Kate. Fred oversees research, administration, research compliance, and research development across all of IU's campuses. Fred's work focuses on information privacy, security, and other information law and policy issues. He served as the founding director of IU's Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research from 2003 to 2014, and has served as managing director of the IU Center for Law, Ethics, and Applied Research in Health Information. Fred is frequently cited in publications and scholarly articles for his work in cybersecurity. Indeed, the IBJ, the Indianapolis Business Journal, actually just published an interview with Fred around privacy in the United States, which is a pretty fitting topic for today's discussion. Our next speaker is Zach Heck. Zach is an associate with the law firm of Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister in Dayton, Ohio. Zach is also an alum of this law school and frequently returns to campus to engage with students. Zach's practice focuses on privacy and data security. Specifically, he assists clients in the areas of privacy compliance, defense litigation, class action defense, and guidance in the aftermath of an information security event, including data breaches. Our next panelist is Nick Merker. Nick is a partner and co-chair of Ice Miller's Data Privacy and Practice in Indianapolis. Before practicing law, Nick served as a computer systems, network, and security engineer. Nick's technology background gives him the unique ability to bridge the gap between lawyers and technologists, oftentimes translating between the two disparate disciplines to resolve legal issues. Nick is also a member of Indiana University's Cybersecurity Advisory Council. And finally, last but not least, is Scott Shackelford. Scott will be moderating today's panel. Professor Shackelford serves on the faculty of Indiana University, where he is the Cybersecurity Program Chair, along with being director of the Ostrom Workshop Program on Cybersecurity and Internet Governance. Professor Shackelford's work has been published in numerous outlets, including the American Business Law Journal, the University of Illinois Law Review, and the Wisconsin Law Review. Additionally, Professor Shackelford has presented his research on cybersecurity at diverse forums, including universities such as Harvard, Notre Dame, and the University of Wisconsin, as well as for the Prime Minister and Cabinet of the Office of Government of Australia and NATO. Please welcome our guest.
Thank you so much, Zach, and thanks to Grace, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this beautiful evening. What are you doing here? Seriously. No, I'm kidding. It really is a pleasure, and thanks again, of course, first and foremost, to our distinguished panelists for taking time out of their very busy schedules. As was mentioned, I get to be the moderator this evening, so I get to ask these wonderful softball questions like, is there a human right to privacy, and not answer them. So what we'll do is we'll have a kind of an initial, a question to get the ball rolling. Feel free to take that in any direction you would like to, looking into our very opaque crystal balls as to the future of privacy. And then we'll dig into some topics like GDPR, CCPA, and then we'll open it up from there to the audience, right? So hopefully this will be a nice wide-ranging discussion. So to get us started, this is a classic question that was developed by committee, so it's a little long, so excuse that. Privacy is a vast concept that's culturally relative and has evolved since being defined as the right to be let alone. As you guys might be aware, that definition was driven in part by a newfangled technology at that time, back in 1890, the mass-produced camera, right? So the first question is, these days, is a private life even possible in an increasingly interconnected world comprised of smart devices, homes, and cities? How would you define the right to privacy today? And I have no particular order here. Should we just start? You go ahead and take that easy one, Nick, and we'll work our way down to Fred.
Sure. I think we've transitioned into there's probably a right to be informed about what is happening with your data. You can't avoid other people. You can't avoid sharing your data. You can't afford people knowing what you're doing. All of us, everyone in the room probably has a cell phone. And I don't care what type of cell phone you have, no matter how much work you put into it, you're going to be giving data to some company, and they're going to be using it in some way, and you probably don't know exactly what they're doing. But if you really spend the time and try to learn about their privacy practices, you can be informed. And I think that's about as far as we can go today.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's still possible to live a private life, and I don't think you need to be Ted Kaczynski to be able to do it. But it's about choices, I think, ultimately. Because, yeah, you have the right to be informed, and there are great things called privacy policies and terms of use. I know you all read them because I write many of those, so hopefully you're reading my hard-spent work. But you've got that ability to kind of understand what you're doing and what you're putting out there. And privacy ends up being a two-way street because it's what you put out into the world, but as a community, it's about what we take. So, for example, from a very primitive example, if you hear rumor, if you hear gossip, it's up to you whether or not you spread that rumor, you spread that gossip, or you forward that email chain, or you send that picture that might embarrass or might humiliate someone. So I think it ends up, to the extent that we want to maintain privacy in 2019, it's how we interact with that. And you might be saying, okay, Zach, well, that's cute. Right, that's a very cute idea, but practically, is that possible? And I think the example I would point to, how many in here know the name Steve Bartman? Yeah, we've got a few people, presumably Cubs fans, and he was the person in 2003 that reached out for the foul ball that ended up costing the Chicago Cubs the opportunity to go to the World Series. Now, he was one factor in that. There was a game after that. There were coaching errors, playing errors, a lot going on. No. But he had to be escorted out by security that night for his own safety and protection. He was across headlines for weeks after that, single-handedly being pointed as the blame for that loss. And 16 years later, he's living a relatively private life. He didn't change his name. He presumably still lives in Chicago, but I spent about a half hour this morning Googling and trying to track him down, and all I could find over the last 16 years was one interview that someone was able to track him down in a parking garage to ask him what he's been doing with his life. He said no comment. He had the opportunity to expose his life through social media. He had the opportunity to try and do a book deal, to be on some D-list celebrity reality show. He had all those opportunities, but he chose not to put himself out there in that way, and his community, his coworkers, his friends, his family, chose to respect his request for privacy, and as a result, he's just a face in the crowd in America's third largest city. So I think it's possible. I think it's hard. I think it's a different flavor to have privacy today. It's not the same as it was when Warren and Brandeis wrote their article, or even before we were making use of the internet. But I think it's still a value that we can have if, as a community, we buy into it and we share it.
What do you think, Fred? Right to be informed? Is notice and consent still a viable option?
Thought I'd have thought of something by now. You want to say something? So part of the problem, I think, we have this massive debate going on about privacy, and in some ways it's been going on maybe 30 years, but it's certainly intensified right now. In California and Europe, between them, have kind of caught the rest of the country in the middle, and yet we don't have the faintest idea of what we're talking about when we say privacy, because the word just means so many things. And so, you hang the little sign out your hotel room at night that says privacy, meaning you don't want somebody knocking on your door and interrupting you. And we talk about privacy in the way that Europe talks about data protection. We don't talk about data protection. We talk about privacy, but we use it to mean the same thing. And then, there are government access issues. We talk about privacy. I tend to think of privacy today as unfortunately captured in a debate that really another academic Alan Weston really launched in the late 1960s when he said privacy is all about control. And so that's pretty dominant. That's the California law. The word control or consent is used 72 times in the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe. We talk a lot about privacy as control, and if that's it, then no, privacy's over. We don't have any privacy because meaningfully we can't control much of anything. That's a real problem. If we think of privacy as more the way we use it in real life, which is not in terms of control, I don't hang the little sign out my door at night because I want to be controlling who passes in the hallway. I want to stop you from bothering me. And instead think about privacy as freedom from harm or freedom from shock or freedom from intrusion or something else. I think we have a lot of privacy and have the potential to have a lot more. I mean, your example is an excellent one. Many of us have that. Privacy in this sense is often associated with property. If you've got a door to close at night, if you've got a house that you don't have neighbors sharing the wall with you, you're going to have more privacy. And this has always been true. This is what Warren and Brandeis were complaining about. Two rich people who were concerned that their money wasn't buying them enough privacy. And so in this sense, I think we can actually think about privacy as something that is challenged but isn't in any way dead.
Okay. Not even on life support.
Not even on life support.
Well, since you mentioned it, let's go to that one next. So what role do you guys think the government should have in mandating these baseline data protection or privacy standards in the vein of GDPR, right? So there's an active debate right now. The GAO put out a report not too long ago basically saying that maybe we need to look hard at a GDPR-type model for the U.S. at the federal level, not just leaving it to California. So I'm wondering, do you see value in that? And two, even if we could do it, is that the direction we should head? Or frankly, are there some things that we're doing better when it comes to data protection here in the U.S. than the EU is? Thoughts?
So I think that's a tough question, and the answer that I think you'll get from people lies with their political affiliation, and I know mine does. I'm a huge proponent of self-regulation. I think we already have some self-regulation in the privacy space, definitely with cybersecurity. PCI DSS was a self-regulatory concept until the FTC started enforcing it as the commercially reasonable security standards with Wyndham. But it was a self-regulatory approach. We have the agriculture industry. John Deere and others came together with the farm data use principles and said they're all going to adhere to that. That's a self-regulatory approach. The Digital Advertising Alliance came out with a self-regulatory approach with your ad choices. So we have some great, I think, self-regulatory practices that I think are working. And to me, it would be much better to have the industry regulate itself and make consumers aware of what they're doing than to have the government try to enforce regulation that is slow and is to me wasteful. But that you can kind of guess what my political affiliation is with my stance on that.
Sure. No, thank you.
I'll tell you, an omnibus approach would make my life easier as a lawyer. Instead of having to go through a patchwork of different statutes and sectors that my clients are in. So there's value from that standpoint, but what I've experienced in my practice over the we're almost a year now of having to deal with GDPR being in effect, and in the months leading up to it, we'd get a phone call probably 3 or 4 a day asking, what's GDPR? Is this something I need to worry about? Is this something that is going to affect me? And I thought, okay, we're going to keep getting those calls until maybe July or August, and then they'll slow down. I got one an hour before I got here, and it averages it's about 3 or 4 a week. But it's still questions, and what that tells me is that this idea of data being regulated regardless of what it is, regardless of what sector it comes from, is something that's uncomfortable for a lot of businesses, because in many ways they're having to think about these questions for the first time if they're not regulated. And I think there's value if you look at either regulating by sector or self-regulation, but there needs to be an incentive to do that. Now, we're getting there. We're getting closer, because if you think about the California Consumer Privacy Act, that was originally a voter initiative that got it onto the ballot and then watered down eventually. But there's a base out there, and there's a movement to try and get more regulation, because we say that we care about privacy. Now, whether we do or not, I think sometimes it's a selective caring for privacy. But regardless of that, with respect to whether the government should regulate, whether you should regulate ourselves. I think it's inevitable that at some point we will get there. It might not be for 20 years. It might not be for 30 years. It might not be in the form of an omnibus federal law, but Europe started it. California has now brought it to the U.S. in a diluted form, but so goes California, so goes the nation. It might be in the form of 50 different states like we see with breach response statutes. But I think that there's an impetus there to address it, to regulate it, and I'm not for sure what form it will take. But what I advise my clients is, let's go ahead and get in front of it now. Let's not wait 10 years when we get this law and find out, okay, it's a year and a half until it's effective. You're going to have to do all this stuff from scratch. Whether you're regulated by GDPR or California, whatever, let's just go ahead and get the groundwork going, because either your customers are going to want it, your consumers are going to want it, or a regulator is going to start asking questions. And that's what we're seeing for a lot of our, especially healthcare clients and our practice. We get audits all the time of, what administrative safeguards do you have? What technical safeguards do you have? Attach your policies to this. So it's something that people are wanting, people are asking questions about. The form that regulation takes, I don't know what it's going to be.
I testified last week at the FTC in their 2-day hearing about, are we going to have a privacy law? And I would say probably for the first time in my almost 30 years in this field, there was nearly unanimous agreement that we are going to have an omnibus privacy law. But a lot of disagreement about when. And so let me say, we've been saying we're going to have an omnibus security law for what, a decade, and we still don't have it. I wouldn't hold my breath that we're going to see it anytime soon. I would say, I sort of have always described myself as a libertarian. I've certainly been a libertarian on the view of the value of privacy law, partly because almost every time we enact a law around privacy, we do the wrong thing. We inundate people with notices they don't read. We provide a lot of thing that looks like protection but isn't really protection. We enforce as contracts things that were merely disclosures. We do all sorts of bad things. And so on the one hand, I worry a lot if Congress tries to take its hand at writing a comprehensive privacy law, just how bad might they get it. On the other hand, I have to say I think we're sort of passing the time for self-regulation to be enough, particularly in a world of global internet engaged activities, and when most of the rest of the world is going to have omnibus laws, that it's going to be hard to say, no, go look up this sector in this state to find out what it is you need to do. It's great work for lawyers, by the way. You should law all the little laws you can get. But I think it might be time. Now, what it very well might look like, of course, is just some broad statements of sort of principle, and then lots of delegated rulemaking authority, either to specific agencies. So the SEC does it for the securities market, and the financial regulators do it for the financial services market, or the Federal Trade Commission finally gets regulatory authority. It could do it. So it might be more regulation than legislation.
And just as a quick follow-up, do you think that could resemble or should resemble something like a GDPR type approach?
Oh, God, I
there
hope
be
not.
some? Yeah.
I think the GDPR is not enough time to say the bad things about it. It is highly bureaucratic. It's like a Christmas tree that everybody hung an ornament on. There is nothing in the world of privacy that you could not find in the GDPR if you looked hard enough. There's, risk management and accountability and breach notification and and consent is still there, but then they don't allow consent in certain instances. And I think we also have to worry. One thing that has to be part of this conversation is data really is kind of the lifeblood of a lot of innovation and of our economy. And if you want to think about what the effect of a highly bureaucratic, burdensome privacy law or regulation is, think about Europe and then name a European search engine. Name a European social media site that you use. Name a European anything that's innovative that you actually care about. You've got to go to China or the U.S. to find those. And we have more law than China, but neither of us have this highly bureaucratic approach that Europe has used.
And if I can jump in, I think that's my issue with the omnibus privacy laws is that I'm a privacy lawyer. Our firm has made a lot of money on GDPR compliance, and there are articles and recitals within the GDPR that I have no idea what they mean. And I'm now waiting for a supervisory authority to release guidance that might shed some light on what this language means. But oftentimes the guidance doesn't really make the gray areas less gray. A real quick example in the United States with the HIPAA breach notification rule, if you lose PHI, you have to inform people without unreasonable delay not to exceed 60 days. And they released a ransomware guidance trying to explain whether ransomware constitutes a breach of PHI. And it was clear whoever wrote this at OCR, I mean, great people, they don't understand what ransomware is. There's a presumption that if a piece of ransomware infects a computer and encrypts all the files, that's a breach, even though this type of ransomware may not exfiltrate data at all, may not ever disclose it to an attacker. But that's a breach that you have to address. So I'm a pessimist on regulation, but the regulations out there, I'm just waiting for other people to tell me what it means, and oftentimes I don't get the guidance that I really want that would help the client and the people that the stuff impacts.
Well, and I mean, Europe is a perfect example about that. I mean, think about it. The regulation has 3 fundamental requirements. I mean, these are the human rights components of the regulation, and that is that all data processing must be fair, lawful, and transparent. Okay, what does fair mean? Really? What does it mean? I've never found a European regulator who had the faintest idea. It can't mean lawful because you've already got lawful in there, and it can't mean transparent. Now try to define fairness without saying lawful or transparent. Great. This is one of the 3 foundational obligations. This is like constitutional law for the European Union, and there's not a person there who has an idea what it means. It just sounded good, I guess. Kind of trips off the tongue.
That's right. Well, I'll go through 1 or 2 more, guys, but as a heads up to the audience, in just a few minutes, we'll start asking more questions from you. Okay, so do start thinking if you haven't already. So it's been brought up, the CCPA in California, obviously rife with drafting errors, rife with concerns. It will be amended. It's not clear what final format will take, but we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about it at least a little bit. So I'm curious to get each of your opinions on what you think of course, the current act as it's drafted. Feel free to tear it apart. But also, where do you think California should go looking ahead to January next year if it really does become, as we all expect, the baseline standard, the default standard if we don't have action at the federal level? Any thoughts on CCPA?
We'll need a lot of Attorney General guidance on what the stuff means if it's not going to be amended. But I will say that I think California did a great job in advancing the conversation in the United States. We wouldn't be talking about a federal privacy bill if California didn't have this law that is coming down the pike on January 1st, 2020. It also got New York to start talking about it. So just that alone, the actual what the law says, I mean, who cares? But the fact that they have something on the books got people talking about it, and I really do think it advanced the federal privacy law question. But that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. And you think about California, if so goes California, so goes the rest of the country. I mean, they were the first to put together a state breach notification law. They've always been the first to set out basic privacy statute protection. So it's not surprising that they're the first to kind of come out the gate with this law. It's kind of a diluted GDPR. But to Nick's point, he's exactly right. We don't really know the content of it too much. We know some basic protections. We know some basic rights that are going to be afforded, but there's questions as to what entities are going to be covered by it, right? There's issues as to who constitutes a consumer in California that would be governed by it. So those are 2 pretty fundamental questions that you need to have answered with a law: who has to abide by it and who's protected by it. So there's going to take some time. I think there's a reason why it goes into effect January 1, but it won't be enforced until July 1 because they're taking time, they're assessing. If you study the legislative trajectory of that law, it was originally a voter initiative and kind of this last-minute brokered deal to get it off the ballot because it was much further down the line than what I think the state was prepared to go with. And had it passed through a voter referendum, amending a voter referendum law in California is much, much more difficult than amending something passed by the state legislature. So that's why you see this kind of foundation being laid, and then every 4 or 5 months talks of more amendments, more changes, because they're catching up. They're trying to get there, and I'm hopeful that they get to this place to where we get some more clarity and other states have a nice model to go to. But only time will be able to tell with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's not a good law, and it's a perfect example of how not to write one. I mean, you could literally teach the course in legislation here at the law school by using that as the model of what not to do.
Was it a week that they took to?
3 days.
3 days.
At the time it finally got done, because they had this deadline for getting the initiative certified to be on the ballot. The proponent of the initiative had to agree to pull it. He wouldn't pull it unless they passed a law. So they passed the law at rocket speed. But it is also a reminder. I mean, I think many years ago, Maine enacted the first health privacy law, state law in the country, and it took 18 days before they repealed it because it had all sorts of unintended consequences. And now we're looking at the same thing. California also has all of these unintended or uncontemplated consequences. Even the guy who was the proponent of the ballot initiative, one of these well, maybe I should avoid adjectives, but anyway, a very wealthy man with not very much to do, and so we thought this would be an interesting thing to do, and now he's publicly quoted as saying, I'm so sorry I got this started, I didn't realize. By the way, it's going to put real estate use of data out of business, because one of the things it allows is that there has to be a button on your website that says, do not sell my data. Yeah. And, of course, where do you think we get all real estate listing data, comparables, things like that? It's from this marketplace and data. So he's like, ooh, that was a bad idea. I should have thought that through. And so, again, back to your initial skepticism, Nick, about statutes in this area, it's a pretty positive, powerful reminder. I would also say there are 90 bills pending in state legislatures as of last week. And so I think there's little question we're going to see 8 or 9 more before the legislative season's over, 8 or 9 enacted. And suddenly we're going to be asking, again, great work for practicing lawyers, not just what you have to comply with, but what do you do when these compliance obligations disagree? Because it may not be just more of a kind. Like, do you have to notify in 5 days or 7 days or whatever, in which case just comply with the most conservative one, you'll be okay. You may have totally different obligations. And how do you comply with inconsistent obligations?
Well, turning away from statutes then, just for a minute, and I'll have the other questions I can fill in, but after this we'll open it up, okay? The NIST cybersecurity framework has done a lot to help, establish some baseline or at least a useful data point in conceptions of reasonable cybersecurity and due diligence. What hope do you guys have for the NIST privacy framework to establish a similar baseline when it comes to privacy protections? Is NIST going about this the right way? What are your thoughts? Get out the crystal ball. Can NIST save us?
I don't know if NIST will save us, but we already have a ton of privacy frameworks that exist. There's the OECD framework, the FIP. There's the generally accepted privacy principles. There's all sorts of things out there. But what NIST might do is take those high-level frameworks, because all those are pretty high-level, and maybe turn it into something more practical, which is what they did in information security. So I'm hopeful that they'll do something, but I don't know when that will be. Fred might be more equipped to answer that question.
Yeah, I think it's certainly helpful. It's nice to have. I know I do a lot of work with federal contractors, so certainly they have their obligations under NIST, and it's been an education for them, especially when they're handling. They already have and accustomed to handling different types of controlled unclassified information. Now to have this NIST framework put on them, it forces them to reevaluate how they're governing data, how they're securing it, how they're keeping it. But like Nick said, it's one of many frameworks we have. HIPAA can be a framework. If you think about that, when you look at the world, and the U.S. is often deemed inadequate when it comes to data protection, which is a very European way of snubbing someone. You're inadequate. But HIPAA is something the Europeans love. They absolutely would adopt. And so if you look at NIST and you look at how it's being approached from the federal government standpoint, but also Ohio just last fall, the governor signed into law the Ohio Data Protection Act, which is an incentive for businesses to adopt one of 8 different frameworks. NIST is one of them. HIPAA is one. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley safeguards rules another one. But if you enact one of them, even if you're an unregulated entity, you adopt one, you have a breach, you're sued under tort law for that breach. You have an affirmative defense against that lawsuit by pointing to the framework that you've adopted. And I think by looking at states that are adopting NIST as that part, and I think Ohio is the only law or the only state that's enacted such a affirmative defense, but if you start seeing other states, particularly your business-friendly states, start to adopt similar affirmative defenses, and they're looking to NIST for that, I think it's another arrow in the quiver for that kind of defense.
Sort of, I mean, I think NIST has been very useful in a lot of areas. I mean, we all depend on NIST every day, even if we don't think about it. It's how we know a pound is a pound and a yard is a yard, even though they'd like those all to be kilograms and meters. But I worry a little bit in privacy, though, exactly for the reasons already mentioned. If you just do a survey of the types of standards we use in our current laws and in other areas, they're all, about 40 years out of date, which is, they're all based on something that was adopted in 1980, the OECD guidelines, as mentioned. And these were based on a very transactional notice of the way data works. So notice, consent, I tell you I'm going to collect your data. We agree on the terms. You give me the data. I'm then bound by those terms. If I don't live up to those terms, then you can sue me. You can have access to the data. It's based on a way data has not moved in decades, probably in most of your lifetime. And so a world in which, refrigerators collect data and cars collect data and every one of you has a phone that's a supercomputer, it's not a terribly useful way to work, and it kind of assumes that you're going to protect your own data. It's very user-centric. It's in that sense, you could almost call it a human rights sort of approach. It's not so the idea that NIST is going to take that and then break it into standards and substandards and requirements and kind of terrifies me. It may take something that's vague and bad and make it really specific and bad.
Excellent. All right, let's start to open it up because I know there's tons of fodder to continue the conversation. Questions? Any questions to get us going here? Yeah, Grayson, feel free.
All right. So this is not a question. I would just generally... What?
Comment or reflection?
No, this is just generally, I would like to see the various panels talk about the intersection of cybersecurity and privacy, how they conflict with each other, and how they maybe help each other.
Okay. There is no privacy without security, right? Any reflections on that?
I'll go first. So I started out in information security, and I often counsel clients on sometimes information security and privacy have competing objectives. And so, for example, I was running an HR situation with a client where they wanted to fire somebody. So they did the whole classic, we put this employee on a performance improvement plan that there's no way they're going to meet, and then we're going to fire them in 3 months. And what the information security person called me and said, I'd like to monitor every single thing that this employee does. I want to know when they get up to go to the bathroom. I want to know if they go out of the building with paper files. I want to know everything that they're doing, looking at their email. And then, I was thinking from an information security standpoint, that makes complete sense to me. But from a privacy standpoint, have we thought about that employee's rights at all? Would the employee be pretty upset if they knew we were doing this surveillance on them? We're doing it, no one else in the company. So I often think that, of course, you can't have privacy without security. You can't put privacy with security because sometimes they have competing interests. And I think the GDPR, for all of its warts, kind of talks about that with the data protection officer and that there can't be a conflict of interest. And we have that decision pre-GDPR from the German supervisory authority that kind of says, hey, you probably shouldn't make your CISO your data protection officer because they have competing interests. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. There's certainly, I see it more in a cooperative context, but that's mostly by virtue of my practice, is where you're trying to figure out how do we respect privacy by amplifying security, and what are the best ways to do that. So in my practice and in what I see more of that cooperative support, but I think Nick's example is perfect of there are instances in the law where you do have those competing interests, and trying to figure out which prevails. I mean, I think in that example, does the employee even have a right to privacy in the workplace? You know, and at least in that example. So there's certainly wrinkles when you get to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think this was my final exam question, and you're just getting even. I wish I had what you said for that, and then I would just use it here. Then you'd be really impressed. I mean, I think that's true. They're obviously many times connected, and sometimes they're competing with each other. I do think cybersecurity has become one way that has often illuminated or led to enforcement around privacy. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, the earliest enforcement action we really saw the FTC bring was right here against the Eli Lilly and Company when they sent out an email discontinuing its Prozac reminder service, and they managed to reveal the names of the 800 people who subscribed to it. It was a pure security error. They didn't intend to. It was just a coding error. It was done by a Purdue graduate. What do you expect? But in any event, they managed to reveal all of the names. Well, the FTC brought that as a privacy action. Nobody even heard of a security action then. Mm-hmm. And this is what we always point to as the first privacy action brought, but it was a security action. And I think we see this a lot, and it's not a bad thing necessarily. In other words, one reason a thoughtful company might have to say, I'm not going to collect that data, is if you fear you're going to be liable if it's lost or stolen. Because one of the things cybersecurity people say is that really everything is capable of being lost or stolen. Like I mean, even the NSA has a lot of trouble actually hanging on to data. That's how we know so much about what's going on. And so as a result, this may be one of the greatest pressure points for stronger privacy is because of the inadequacy of security.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. But privacy professionals and information security professionals often think very differently too.
Oh, yeah.
For a quick example, an information security professional, when I worked at Cars.com, I headed up information security there, and if someone came to me with our database and said, Nick, we have this customer database, we have 10 years of social security numbers, we have credit card information, we have banking information, I need you to protect this data. I'd go, all right, here's all the walls I'm going to put around this database. If I put my privacy hat on, my first question back is, why the hell do we have this data? Yeah. So it's just a different way of thinking. And mm-hmm. Whenever clients want to put their privacy office under their CISO or inside their information security department, it really gives me some discomfort.
Yeah. Excellent. Please, yeah.
Mentioned HIPAA compliance and the importance of health data protection, which is a little bit different from the way that other types of data are protected, because in lots of health studies, you get people who submit their data to the researchers and they never really hear back, and kind of like in the scenario you just mentioned, they have this pool of data that's very protected and very siloed. But in the context of health data, you might get people who want to share their data with other studies to kind of make more use of it since it's already in existence. Do you think that in the context of health research, we're erring so far to the side of data protection that we neglect the possibility of data sharing?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. And actually, if you look at HIPAA, it's got this wonderful group of carve-outs of things you can do with the data without getting consent. Mm-hmm. And some of them are very obvious, reporting infectious diseases and something like that. Some are really not. Marketing, for example, is permitted with only opt-out consent. You don't have to get an opt-in consent. And it's like research was not at the table. And so the notion we could use your data to save your life or somebody else's life, that either requires explicit written consent or you have to go through a data review board, IRB, some structured way of getting that dealt with. And the other piece of that question, which I think is an important one, and that is HIPAA, again, almost all law, I mean, I think this is true in general, is kind of written for what happened yesterday. And so they always tend to be a little out of date. HIPAA was especially that way as a regulation. And so it kind of ignored the fact that most of us generate and use health information that's not protected health information because it's not used for treatment or payment. So, for example, our phones. Mm-hmm. I've got 6 or 8 apps on my phone that are health apps. None of those are regulated by HIPAA. The sharing of data on the web. Really, type in any disease state whatsoever, and you will find a web support group where people are voluntarily sharing their life story, or just get on a plane somewhere, and some person will sit down next to you and want to tell you about all of their health calamities, and that's why you carry those earbuds, so you can put them in your ear and pretend that you're not listening to them because you're listening to something else. But none of that is protected. So like we say, well, we really protect health information, but only if it comes in a certain format in a certain industry and is born through a certain way.
Yeah.
Any elaboration?
Yeah, one of the interesting things I found in talking to clients who are particularly startups, and they're not covered entities in any way, shape, or form, but they're collecting information relating to people's health. And so one of the things that we always have to be careful about is, one, from this privacy perspective, are we collecting data that we actually need to be able to produce the service? Is that something that is necessary, or are you collecting it just because you want it and you'll figure out what you're going to do with it later? So that's always the preliminary question. Then the second issue is, how do we give notice to our customer, not because we particularly have to, but how do we give notice in such a way to where we say, we're collecting information relating to your health because you're giving it to us. You need to understand that we'll have administrative, technical, and physical safeguards around it, but because those are the buzzwords when you're in privacy and security, right? You say those three words, people nod and say, oh, that sounds good. But how do we say that and then also say, but by the way, we are not a covered entity under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, nor will we be regulated by it, nor should you expect the same protection as you would a covered entity or a business associate unless we've agreed to it to the contrary. So we see that there's sharing of data for outstanding services, for research services, for anything under the sun, but getting those workarounds with HIPAA, particularly when there's a perception for your everyday person that, well, if it's health information, it's treated differently because of HIPAA, right? You're always kind of dealing with that perception, trying to figure out how you navigate informing them, or at least putting it in your policy in terms of use, to where when they come back and complain, you can say, well, it was right there. We told you.
But HIPAA has done a few things right, and one thing I think HIPAA does well is its de-identification approach has really advanced. One, the OCR guidance on how you comply with their safe harbor principles, and they just have a great de-identification guidance that you can read. And then also there are private companies that do the statistical method for de-identification that describe their methods and how they have de-identified PHI. So at least in that, so they can then share it with other companies. So at least in that context, I think HIPAA has done a good job of helping out on I don't know what they helped out, but I do like that guidance that they put out.
Help the Europeans. Great, guys. Other questions? I have one I can fill in well. Okay, yeah, no, feel free.
So I've got a question that kind of like multiple things, but it's pretty much about California's privacy laws. So essentially, how do you win, and how do you think different states will, follow up with California? Do you think they're going to wait until after and then kind of use it as a guide, or do you think they'll kind of go, use it as a guide but completely go separate from it? And then what do these states have like kind of take into account when they're writing their own individual privacy laws? Like, what's important for each individual state, like California, like when they're writing these things up?
So we did cover this just a little bit already, so we know that 8 or 9 states might enact similar bills potentially this year. But what should those states be taking into account? Is there anything at the state level that may be following on Ohio or other examples that might be beneficial, that maybe is not part of the conversation right now?
I think any time you can incentivize it's helpful, right? You always win more with a carrot as opposed to a stick.
And safe harbor is the way to do that,
right.
Do you think?
I think there are ways. And what I really liked about Ohio's law is that it's for such a small scenario. It's just for a very particular scenario. If you're sued following a data breach under a tort theory, you have an affirmative defense. I mean, that's by no means a silver bullet in anything. But it's been enough to start getting calls from companies that see it, that hear it, they like it, and then they want to explore it, and they want to have want to learn more about. And we've had more traction with our clients and with client development because of that than when you go out on a speaking tour and sound like Dr. Doom telling people, oh my God, your data is going to get out there and you're going to get sued. Like, we've just seen way more interest and enthusiasm because of that incentive. So I'd like to see maybe a little less of what we have with California, a little bit more of what we saw in Ohio last fall.
Some more carrots all around? Okay.
But you have to have enforcement, though.
Yeah.
I mean, California has laws on the books right now that are not enforced. Some of them are kind of worthless. Like California has a law where you have to, in your privacy notice, disclose how you respond to do not track signals, which no one does. I mean, and then they also their law that requires a privacy statement on a website that is interacting with California residents is not really enforced. So if you don't have the enforcement, if you don't have the stick to companies, I don't know if they're going to comply with the law.
Yeah.
I think California is likely to be the floor, and we're going to see more and more restrictive laws as states try to show we take privacy even more seriously. And it will only take 3 or 4 major states, really. I mean, Texas, I think, is pretty likely to pass something this year. Washington State. You add New Jersey or New York or another, big populated state to that, and then I think the chances of federal legislation that include preemption just keep ratcheting up. Right now, I mean, my impression, I could be completely wrong, I usually am, but is that industry is still not quite yet ready to pay the price for preemption. Some sort of really, fairly strong law or private right of action or punitive damages and that the price of preemption is going up every day. I mean, California raised it dramatically. But that at some point preemption is just going to become a necessity of doing business. And remember, Europe now has one law for 28 countries, soon to be 27. We have lots of laws, but lots of them are only one state. They're not enforced. It's not clear to whom they apply. At some point, I think the issue about state laws is not going to be as much about their uniqueness as rather how much they collectively drive some sort of federal reaction.
And then I think, Gabe, I saw your hand as well. Yeah.
Questions, and I think Professor Kate has partially answered one of them. My first question is, if a national law does get passed, in your opinions, if it'll be stronger or less strong than current California law? And the second one is more hypothetical than that. Do you think an Indiana law might get passed before a federal law?
My only quick comment is if we pass a federal law and it is not enough to be deemed adequate by the European Commission, then what do we even do? So that's all I hope that happens. Because right now it's a really confusing state to get data from. I work with a lot of service providers in the United States. They work with EU customers, and just getting, are you using standard contractual clauses, privacy? It's just a mess. So getting something on the books that at least is adequate would be nice.
Yeah, and that's a big point. Probably a third of the work I'm doing right now is negotiating data processing agreements under GDPR. And in order to have that sharing of data between the United States and a European Union member and a business in there, you have to negotiate these agreements that comply with Article 28 that sets out what the safeguards are going to be, how it's going to happen, if you're going to use sub-processors, who you can delegate to, all of that. And what it morphed into with these agreements is an opportunity not just to negotiate this agreement that they have to negotiate, but let's negotiate the larger agreement too. So you see this kind of collateral effect to where the attention is supposed to be only on data processing. But if we're going to negotiate this addendum, let's go ahead and negotiate the whole thing. And so what that ends up doing is that's just more time, that's more resources, that's more costs that are invested in that. And so, if the U.S. is going to pass a federal law on this, it needs to be something that's going to be able to jive better with the way the Europeans are regulating to at least make it worthwhile. Because otherwise, we're just kind of looking out for ourselves and not thinking about the larger picture in an increasingly global world.
And Fred,
I
if you
think
wanted
you're
to
seeing the
reflect-
difference here between practitioners and professors, because inconsistent with Europe provides enormous opportunities for travel to Europe, for meetings, for conferences, for long and difficult discussions in beautiful places. Nobody ever has meetings in ugly places in Europe. I think we will see a federal law. I think it will be stronger because there is no reason to pass a weaker one. If you're not going to get preemption, industry will not support it, and Congress won't enact it if industry doesn't support it. I can't imagine it will be found adequate. I mean, I agree it'd be great. I'm not in any way disagreeing. But partly for political reasons. I mean, I just can't see Europe, the data protection authorities of the 28 member states saying, you know, the U.S. is finally here. I remember they didn't find Australia adequate, and Australia had a nearly identical privacy law. And you know, they found Canada adequate. Now they're making Canada redo its law to maintain its adequacy. I just would be surprised. And will Indiana enact the law? I have no idea. I mean, there's a fair amount of pressure for it. It led a lot by Matt Pierce, who represents this district. On the other hand, he's in the wrong party. I mean, that party, he's a Democrat. You can't get anything through the state legislature as a Democrat. So I guess I'd be surprised, but you all might know better than me what's going on in the State House.
Yeah. Or any reflections on the general state of privacy law in Indiana, even without this new approach.
We have one of the more active attorney generals than and really any other state, or at least, I mean, maybe I'm seeing it because I practice in Indiana, but that office is very active. We work a lot of data breaches that involve Indiana. We get the most questions from the Indiana AG's office. They file many complaints against entities that they think are doing things wrong. I mean, I think practicing in Indiana as a privacy attorney, if you want to be adverse to the AG's office, there's a lot of work available.
Yeah, and that's an excellent insight, because when we have breaches, we can almost always rely upon Indiana having a follow-up, and you get to know the people in the AG's office pretty well. But they're one of the more active, and part of it, I don't know if it's because of, I don't know why it is actually, because I'd go in and I'd think, okay, Massachusetts, because they corrected me one time and didn't say that a security freeze is $5. I forgot to put that in the newsletter. So they came back and said, oh, you need to include that in your newsletter. And then we heard nothing back. And I thought, okay, well, Massachusetts is going to continuously be very active. It's almost always been Indiana and Colorado. Have been the
Connecticut for me.
Norm entrepreneurs. Other questions, guys? I had one that while it's coming in, this might be a quick one. Certifications. Right? So there's a bit of a push out there right now to inform consumers, inform all of us a little bit more effectively about the privacy and security standards that a given product or service might have, right? So Consumer Reports, we did a project with them this last winter. They have this digital standard, right, that they're trying to roll out for smart TVs, things like that. There's this group, Public Knowledge. They have this idea of a security shield that you can actually apply. And other countries are doing this as well, like the UK Cyber Essentials Plus certificate. So I'm wondering, from the consumer standpoint, what do you think about the utility of these certifications to help inform us about where to put our dollars if we value privacy? Can you do that effectively?
I'll first give with students in the room, take a different angle on certification and talk about practitioners who have certifications. If you want to work in private practice or really anywhere, and you're considering how to make your resume get closer to the top of the pile, getting a certification from the International Association of Privacy Professionals, I think, is a great thing to do. I need to disclose I'm a faculty member for them. But then also, if you're eligible for the CISSP as well, I think that's a great certification to get to make you just different from the other folks that are applying. And then to answer just your other comment, it's weird that I'm going to say this because I'm a pro self-regulatory person, but I think the trust marks, which is kind of where this was before, where you could pay trustee, you could pay McAfee, you could pay other folks, and they would look at your privacy practices and they would put a emblem on your website that says that they looked at you and you're great, and then consumers would trust you. Well, I mean, we've seen Trustee had some allegations by the FTC against them. We've seen other issues with that. How deep of a dive are they doing? So I don't know if these trust marks and just certification in general for products really is the path forward. But
I'm not for sure how much the average consumer looks at it or really invest too much stock in it. I can tell you one certification that's been helpful has been Privacy Shield. I mean, that's just something to where if you're doing cross-border transactions of data, it just makes your life so much easier. And it's always great when I have a client that has it or they want me to go through and renew their certification, although they don't like the word renew. It's certify again. But it just makes things easier. And in terms of business partners, it helps kind of develop that trust there. So I think certifications from that standpoint for B2B relationships, that can go a long way, especially with respect to these audits that come in, and every time they come in, they're more and more detailed. They want more information. They want to see more. Having that certification you won't be able to bypass the audit, but it helps get you on a better footing than if you did not have it. It kind of gives this presumption of, okay, we can continue the conversation.
But you can self-certify under Privacy Shield, which kind of goes to my point.
That's right. I think certifications could be. You could imagine a world in which they're sort of educational.
Yeah.
Like before I go out and buy something, I might look at Consumer Reports and how they rank it, or look at CNET reviews and say, what's your favorite, whatever. But exactly for the reason Nick said, every time somebody posts their Privacy Shield and then it turns out that they lost 500 million records or they gave all your data to some other company without compliance with their own privacy notice, and then immediately the public reaction is, well, what bloody good was that certification? And what often happens is the certifier never cracks down on them, or they crack down so slowly or so after the fact that you're left really undercutting the trust in that. So today, I mean, I'd say I'd never trust that. Like that's a mark of, I would take it as information. It might save me from having to read their privacy policy that you wrote.
Please.
I have a question. With regard to, lastly, we have seen the fines have been imposed on online service providers like Amazon Prime, Spotify, YouTube. They are based in different countries. The main head offices are located differently, but I think YouTube is located, the office location is in US. So none of your business, YB, they are based in Austria, which is a non-profit organization, has filed on those complaints on basis of the users. So do you think what would be your opinion on what's going to be the fate of those companies? And also, when they're attaching the fines, do you think it is discriminatory for smaller firms and larger firms because the percentage of fine is either 4% on the upper level and 2% on the lower level? So how do you discriminate, and what is your opinion on that basis?
Let me just say, I think European fines, which have been so far the largest I think we've really seen, have tended to be fairly sensitive about the size of the organization. One issue they may be inappropriately sensitive to is, are you a U.S. company or are you not a U.S. company? And that has been one of the complaints about the sort of fining mechanism, and particularly now that includes fines up to 4% of your gross revenue. Again, you could say that's because there aren't sort of data-intensive companies that anyone's ever heard of operating in Europe, and so it's more likely to be a U.S. company fine. But I think there's also some suspicion that, if you find somebody local, there's the potential for political ramifications. If you find somebody way across the ocean, there's less likely. In fact, there might be political benefits. And I think it's one of the concerns about the use of broadly discretionary fines. The good side is you can deal with sizes of business and things like that. The bad side is you don't have a lot of control over other issues that might be influencing those fines.
Yeah, I can't speak too much for your larger companies because I've just not had the experience with it. The experience I've had has mostly been your kind of larger or moderate-sized U.S. companies that have a minimal or moderate presence in the EU, and trying to figure out how they would get on the radar for supervisory authority. And it's something that we've not had to deal with that yet, but the way that I've always kind of imagined it would happen for a lot of the clients I have is one of two ways. Either they blow the 72-hour window for a data breach, or they have an employee out there that gets fired or wanted to exercise his right and we didn't comply adequately, and so then he goes and files a complaint. And so I think what Professor Kate said about how there's different spheres in which the focus can be directed, it's a question for me of what do you have to do to stay off that radar? And that's something that we've been counseling our clients to try and make sure that those are two ways that we can preemptively try to focus our attention on to stay off that radar.
I think in the United States, with OCR in particular, because I do a lot of work with HIPAA breach issues, with OCR in particular, I think the fines are almost predictable now, and it's because they have all of these fines out there, and they make their decisions public, and you can see why people are getting hit for what they're getting hit. And so, for example, they have said if you are not conducting a risk analysis under the HIPAA security rule, you're going to get a big fine. And they are really coming down on people. They speak in conferences, and they have said that at conferences. So at least in the United States, I think fines, at least in that one regulatory body, are predictable. So I kind of like what they're doing. But I don't really have any comments about the GDPR fines. I think it's too early to kind of tell what's going on there. Except I'm expecting some major provider just to get slammed by some supervisory authority. It's not really happened to the level I thought it would yet.
Yeah, time for one more.
So I take privacy law with Professor Tomain, and a few months ago we read an FTC complaint about Sears and their privacy policy regarding a piece of software they had, and on line 75 it started in their privacy policy saying that, oh yeah, we collect all your data. So with IoT, I know Scott's doing research on IoT, and basically technology be collecting more data, a more intimate part of our lives. Where do you see the future of notice of consent privacy policies? Are we going to have to look at privacy policies that are 200 lines long for like our refrigerators and toasters and toilets and things like that in 5 years?
Or did GDPR kill it?
So I love 23andMe's privacy statement, and when I teach my IAPP class, I use that as an example. So they've gone to what I think they call it a layered privacy notice. And so what it does is if you go to it, it puts the information you actually care right in front of your face. And the reason I know this is my mother did 23andMe, and she said, Nick, what they're going to do is sell this information to the government, and they're going to look at crimes for my DNA. I was like, Mom, they're not going to do that. And I went on 23andMe, and I looked at their privacy notice, and I went to the law enforcement section. It was very, very clear on what they're going to do. So I think we're moving towards that.
Was she worried about your criminal background? I'm curious why she was raising this.
So she read a story that somebody did a genetic test, the mother, and they found the son who had committed murder because the mother was into the genetic system, and that is why she brought it up. Now, I'm not a murderer.
Okay.
But
thank you for
clarifying
that.
Takes a nosedive. But I think we're going to that layered privacy notice approach to make it more consumer friendly.
Yeah, I think that's the key is we try to find ways when we're putting together privacy policies of how can we use this to further our business relationship with the consumer. And we're under no illusion that anyone is reading these privacy policies regularly or that the vast majority of our clients' consumers are. We write them in such a way to where when we get slammed, the regulator will look at it and they'll be able to say, yeah, this is clear. Someone can understand this. And so I've written some that I remember the client said, we want it to be fun. And so we put together a policy that had a question and answer format and way more exclamation points than I've ever put into a transactional document. But businesses are seeing this as an opportunity to engage with their consumer, and in the off chance that a few do read the privacy policy, they can see it as an extension of their brand. And so I think that's where the market's going to drive a lot of companies when it comes to notice and consent.
I think there's at least some chance that notice and consent is going to disappear from the kind of ubiquitous role it plays now, where you encounter these notices everywhere you go. Like every time you click on a website, you get a cookie notice. And has anyone ever read one of those who doesn't have Esquire after their name? I mean, has anyone ever read a privacy notice? Have you ever, like your iPhone, every week it's like, we want to update you again. It's now 76 screens long. Have any of you paged through all 76 screens? Not you, Grayson. Has anybody else paged through all 76 screens? So in some ways, it really is something only written for regulators and advocates. And I hope what we're going to see is more and more allowing that to move online or move into some other format. So that what you will see is there is a privacy notice, but you will not actually have it jump out on your phone. And, really think about an iPhone again. You have to say, I agree, and then you get a pop-up screen saying, do you really agree? Now think about this. Think about this is ethics, so we're going to get our ethics credit right now. Think about the total lack of ethics of that. To say, we know you have not read it. You haven't paged through it. We know you haven't paged through it. It is impossible for you to know what it says. So our lawyers are going to make you agree to it twice. And we're going to feel good about that? It is such a total bullshit deal. It's time that we really eliminate it. And I think Congress was getting closer and closer on this. To say, we're not going to let you walk away from your obligations through a notice. We're going to actually impose obligations like HIPAA does. You can't walk away from most HIPAA obligations with a notice. And therefore, the sort of reason for writing these long and complicated notices so that you can, either because they're going to be interpreted as contracts or you can hide actionable language like Sears did way down in the notice, that incentive is going to disappear. And so the notice may come to play a much less important role. That's what I hope.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank all of you guys for coming. This was a great evening. We're going to continue it in about 20 minutes over at Nick's. We're going to have some appetizers and stuff if anybody wants to come out and hang out with our panelists. But I'd like to, quick round of applause for our panelists, and thank you for coming.